Hello all, and welcome to this Ask the Expert session for Azure Arc. My name is Guillermo Gomez, and I'm part of the Azure Arc team, and I'm here with some of my teammates in the Arc team. We just want to make sure that we answer as many questions as we can in this 30-minute window. So the way we are going to interact is you can paste your questions in the chat. A chat moderator will approve them, and once it's approved, it will be published. So if you see any questions from somebody else that you're interested on, feel free to use the app voting feature. That way, it helps us identify those questions a little bit easier. With that, remind that this is a recorded session, and please adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. And with that, let me introduce the team. So I have with me today Ryan Puffer. He is our expert on Azure Arc enabled servers. I also have Jason Hansen, which is the expert on Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Tolga and Brian are the experts for Azure Arc enabled data services. And we have Nir Bensby, who is the team lead on the Arc product. And with that, I see that there are some questions already popping, which is great. Even ahead of the session. So Ryan, I think that we're going to get started with some questions for you. The first one is, would you add your Azure VMs to Azure Arc, or is it only for VMs outside of Azure?
Yeah, good question. So the short answer is no, you would not add your Azure VMs to Azure Arc. And that's because all the capabilities that you can get with Azure Arc are already present for Azure VMs. The whole goal of Azure Arc is to bring those cloud native capabilities to those assets which are running either in another cloud or on premises.
Cool. Another question around servers. Are there any DSC aspects to Arc keeping the VMs in the same config state?
Yeah, so you can use the DSC extension with Azure Arc to go and push down a DSC configuration, and that can either be a self-contained independent config or a meta config to onboard to Azure Automation State configuration.
Cool. Another question is, how can we get started with VMware on premises and a few Azure VMs?
Yeah, so all you need to get started with Azure Arc enabled servers is to go to the Azure portal, go ahead, search for servers Azure Arc, and you'll be able to go through a wizard which will help generate a script to onboard your machines. When you get that script, you just run it on your VM, where it's running. It can be on VMware, that's totally fine. And as long as you have internet connectivity, that's all you're going to need to get that VM onboarded and then being able to start managing it through Azure Arc.
Cool. A question here for Nir. Has work begun with the Azure Arc team to manage and control third-party services within Azure? An example are third-party storage vendors that will provide this to Azure VMs. This person feels that Azure would be the ideal place to control the provisioning and modification of set VNets and ISCSI connections.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Thank you. We have not started work with third parties yet. Our first service that we're bringing from Azure to run on-prem and be configured on-prem is the Azure Arc enabled data services, SQL managed instance, and PostgreSQL hyperscale. But you hinted already as the direction that using these technologies that we are bringing to bear, it is very reasonable for us to go and accelerate additional infrastructure and services that will be able to project into Azure and run anywhere. So we'll definitely look into things like storage, networking, and so on, as well as first and third party.
Cool. And another question for you, Nir. Wondering when we will see some kind of identity for Azure Arc virtual machines inside of Azure AD so we can use passwordless code to hit Azure resources.
Yeah, so I think if this question was asked before, we definitely are looking at that. The servers themselves, when they join into Azure Arc, they get a managed service identity. So you can actually use the server identity to access resources in Azure. However, there's much more we can do to kind of provide a seamless passwordless, access both from the server to Azure as well as from Azure into the server. And this is definitely an area that we're looking forward to go and explore some more.
Cool. Question for you, Ryan. Can Arc be used over Cisco HCI?
I'm not familiar with that product. I assume it's just hyper-converged infrastructure from Cisco. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. But if it is, then yes, we really don't care where your server is running. It can be a virtual machine or a physical machine. All it needs to do is run a supported operating system and have internet connectivity so we can reach Azure. After that, you just install the agent and you'll be good to go from there.
Cool. And another question for you, Ryan. Are there any good examples of Azure Arc used to manage AWS VMs?
Yeah, so I don't have any like specific examples of what you can do with it, because technically everything you can do with Arc, you can do on AWS VMs. But we do have the Jumpstart GitHub repository, which I'd highly recommend checking out. We have some examples in there ready to use with AWS templates, so you can go and try Azure Arc on your AWS VMs without having to go figure it out yourself.
Okay, another one for you, Ryan. In regards to Linux patch management, are private subscriber repositories such as Oracle's extended support repositories supported?
Yeah, great question. So Azure Update Management is just querying the local package manager on Linux. So whatever repositories you've configured that package manager to go look for new software updates, it will check all of them and report on any available updates in the Azure portal. So as long as you've got that repository configured on that machine, you should see those packages show up in the Azure portal.
All right, and a question for Nir. Would it be safe to describe this as a plugin or overlay to the Azure agents or on on-site servers?
Yeah, it's a good one. The Arc is really, if you think about it, what Arc does, it bridges the infrastructure and services into the Azure Resource Manager. So an overlay plugin is a good another good way to say that. And once it's there in the Azure Resource Manager, then all the different services that Azure provides basically are then projected and applied to the servers. So for servers would be extensions, Lighthouse, guest configuration policy, all these things that work for servers. And we're trying to get as close as possible to parity with the native Azure. Obviously, there's things that are very local to Azure that you only get when you're in Azure, but we're trying to be able to give you that consistency across your environment, whether it's running in Azure or anywhere else. So great question.
Cool. I have here another question. Can you add an Azure Arc machine to a resource group?
Yeah, that's the way that an Azure Arc. So let's say you have a server on-prem, as Ryan said, physical, virtual, Windows, Linux, domain join, non-domain join, whatever. You install the Arc agent and you specify how this resource should surface in Azure. So usually you would say, I want, let's say your server name is a server X. So I want to have a server X resource show up in a specific subscription resource group. And when you go to Azure, you'll see server X in that subscription resource group. And you can then go operate it, install extensions on it, do update management, DSC, all the stuff that you can do on Azure VMs. So the answer is yes. And I would just go try it. You can even try it with your, your laptop if you want to. It's pretty simple.
And Nir, I know that we've touched on this many times, but I just want to make sure that it's clear on this question. Does Azure Arc require agents or software to be installed in order to manage on-premises systems?
Yeah, you need to have an agent on each of the servers that you're managing. And think about this as the way we think about this. Obviously, it's not yet another agent, because then if you had 50 agents, you now have 51 agents that you need to manage. It's actually the agent that will help you manage all other agents. So, for example, if you're using monitoring and desired set configuration and others on-prem today, you need to go and install these agents separately. Once you install the Azure Arc agent, you can then manage all of these through Azure extensions. So you have that one agent that you install. You can at scale deploy all the relevant Azure extension, whether for monitoring or desired set configuration or just to run a script. And that agent actually takes care of the lifecycle management of the extensions, so that, you know, this is actually a move to reduce the amount of agents that you're running and actually consolidate and make sure you can manage the lifecycle of these agents through one single control plane.
Cool. A question for Ryan. Does Azure Arc enable servers for on-premises servers require hybrid Azure Active Directory join? If not, can domain controllers be managed as well? What about Hyper-V host?
Yeah, good question. So there's no requirement at all for being AAD joined or even regular domain joined. You just got to be able to install that agent, and that's all you need to connect it up into Azure. As far as connecting, specific workloads, you're more than welcome to set it up on a Hyper-V server. We'd recommend exercising caution with domain controllers just due to the sensitivity of those roles. So just remember that the folks who have access to your Azure subscription are able to go and manage that server. So you'll want to have that in an isolated subscription with only the same admins that are managing that domain controller on premises.
And there is a question regarding update management portal experience. I've onboarded a test machine, but when I go to update management, I get this. Update management solution enablement for Azure Arc machines is not supported from the Azure portal experience at this time. Is this a future feature that will be in place?
Yeah, we're working to update the verbiage there, so I do apologize. It is supported today, but you just can't enable it from that screen. If you head over to Azure Automation and then go to Update Management and their portal experience, you'll be able to onboard the Arc server there. And once it's onboarded, that tab in the Arc machine view will show you the missing updates and let you schedule when those updates get installed. So it's just the enablement experience has to happen in the Azure Automation portal page, not the Arc one.
Cool. And I think this question may be for you as well, Ryan. Will we see any Bastion type solution so that RDP to the machines can be established?
Yeah, it's a great feature request. I'd really recommend submitting that on our user voice. We've heard this a few times. Don't have any plans to share at this time, but it is something we're starting to hear more often.
Yeah, so and the user voice is great for everybody to submit whatever feedback they have, right? We maybe can post the link here on the chat. Another question maybe for Nir. How does Azure Arc differ from ASR and Azure Migrate?
Well, let's start with Migrate. So what Migrate is doing is allowing you to assess and move systems from on-prem or other environments into Azure. And Azure Arc works great with Azure Migrate because what you can do, if you think about what Azure Arc does, it allows you to manage the machines, the systems consistently across your environment, even before you migrated them. So let's take a scenario. Let's say you have 1,000 machines and you want to start migrating to Azure, but you know it will take you months or even sometimes years. So what you can do, you can start managing them as if they're running in Azure with Azure Arc. Let's say you then move your first 100 machines, you migrate them, you continuously manage the same way, then you move another batch of 200 machines, same thing, you just continue to manage the same way. So you kind of have your environment while it's still in a hybrid mode, managed in a consistent way while you're migrating it. Once you migrated everything to Azure, then obviously you no longer need Azure Arc on any server on-prem because there's none. So you get to manage your environment fully through Azure. ASR is a disaster recovery solution and is one of the solutions that down the road you'll be able to enable both on-prem as well as on obviously on Azure as well as on-prem through Arc.
Cool. One more question about servers for Ryan. Can I add my WordPress servers in AWS to Azure Arc?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we'd be able to add the server as long as it's running on an EC2 instance you control. If you're doing kind of like a software as a service WordPress solution, we probably wouldn't be able to manage that because you do need to be able to install the agent to manage the whole server.
Cool. And a question for Tolga regarding SQL services. Any plan to add more SQL services to Arc beside managed instance?
Yeah, in our roadmap, we have other SQL engines that we are talking with. We're going to add Synapse and Cosmos later down the road.
Cool. And for Jason, if I have a Kubernetes cluster on AWS running on EC2 or EKS, do I need to have an Azure Arc agent on it that will talk to Azure and let me manage my databases hosted on my Kubernetes cluster using Azure Arc?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there are a few things to unpack there. So if you do have a Kubernetes cluster running on other infrastructure, yes, you can attach that cluster to Azure for management. And very similar to servers, you have an agent or an operator in Kubernetes parlance that needs to be deployed into that cluster. Once that operator deploys, it will call out to Azure and authenticate. You'll then see that cluster as a resource. Now, when it comes to workload management, we have built a configuration management service based on GitOps. And what this allows you to do is to define the desired state for your Kubernetes cluster, and that could be, configurations or applications. You can define those, check those Kubernetes resource files or Helm charts into a repository, and then attach that repo to your cluster. And so that allows you to then manage that workload through your standard sort of pull request-based workflows or through Git. So in the case of managing a particular database, you would be able to do it through that scenario. Now, if you're using Arc-enabled data services, then of course that could also land on that Kubernetes cluster, and you would have management capabilities provided by that particular platform.
Cool. Another question for Nir regarding agents. Can the Arc agent send data to Azure over S2S, VPN, or ExpressRep?
Yeah, so the Arc agent goes outbound through HTTPS to Azure, and then you can configure the route where this would go through. So in Azure, we have a feature called a private network, where you're able to kind of say, hey, don't go out through the internet. I want you to go through this private route directly to the backend of the Azure services. This is coming into Azure Arc enabled servers in the next few months. So you'll be able to send all your data directly into the backend of the Azure services and not going through the internet through this feature of private link. So you have an express route or a VPN that then the requests, HTTPS requests, go through into the backend of the services.
Awesome. And one more question for Ryan. Will there be support for running PowerShell commands on Azure Arc servers like we can do on VMs running on Azure?
Yeah, it is something we're looking into. I think it's called like run command in the Azure VM experience. Not available today, but it is something we're going to try to add.
And I think this question is for Tolga. If we have Azure functions that need to fetch and update data in an on-premises SQL server, we can register, download, and run the script on our SQL Server database to make this possible and don't need VPN service now?
Wait, can you repeat the question? It was a little bit too long.
Yeah, if we have Azure functions that need to fetch and update data in an on-premises SQL server, we can register, download, and run the script on our SQL Server database to make this possible and don't need VPN service now?
So the Azure functionality on Arc is not available today. So if you would need to technically continue as is today.
I think one thing I would say, if this is on a server, you can use custom script extension to run a script on the server. This also answers the previous question. So if you wanted to run something on the server through automation, you could, call basically it's an extension call where you say, hey, go run this script on this server, and you can automate all this through custom script extension to run either on on an Azure VM, obviously, or on a VM connected through Arc.
And a question regarding Azure Stack roadmap, maybe for you, Nir. What's the 6-18-month roadmap for Azure Stack family integration, particularly Azure Stack Hub and Azure Stack HCI? AC's HCI V2 is still in preview.
Yeah, obviously, Azure Stack is already running infrastructure as Azure. So Azure Stack is already, it's not Arc enabled, it is Azure. Just like we don't Arc enable VMs. In Azure, we don't Arc enable VMs on Azure Stack. It's the same thing. For Azure Stack HCI, we're planning full integration so that you can seamlessly control Azure Stack HCI VMs from Azure. So that's on the roadmap.
Cool. And this question maybe for you or Ryan. What level of physical management for on-premises infrastructure Azure Arc offers for servers HCI?
Yeah, I'll take that. So I think this is where obviously you can install Azure Arc agent on a physical server and do like update management, DSC, change inventory, all these things, same as virtual. With HCI, we will work with the team to make it much more seamless, so that we have what we call our best practices for HCI that we will be able to configure seamlessly, so that you don't need to think about it. We will help you configure the systems correctly and manage them from Azure. It will get better and better as time goes by. That's how we're thinking about this.
And another question for you, Nir. Do you see a future where the new Automanage feature that was announced this week would be enabled for Arc machines?
I definitely see that future. It will take us some time together, but yeah, that's definitely a great one to deliver. Yeah.
Maybe this one for Ryan. Can I deploy Azure Arc programmatically over a scope of many VMs? Are there any templates or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. You can definitely generate a script that can go and be used on more than one machine. It'll just take the computer name as the default resource name in Azure. You can use your favorite tooling to go and push that out. So if you use SCCM or Ansible, or even a group policy script could do that. We don't have any documentation today on that, but it's something we're looking to add for sure, because this is a pretty frequent ask.
And I think that answers this other question that I have. How do you deploy the extensions at scale, right?
Yeah, sort of. So I think extensions at scale is a bit of a different beast, because at that point you already have the agent installed on your Arc servers. And so from there, you can do all the at-scale management from the Azure control plane. So you got a couple options there. Easiest one, if you're doing something like the monitoring agents, there is a policy called Enable Azure Monitor for VMs. If you assign that policy and include remediation for the scope of your resource group or subscription where your Arc-enabled servers reside, it will actually go and automatically push out the extensions to any new Arc machines that get added to that scope. So it's a really nice way if you want to make sure all those machines are connecting to the correct log analytics workspace. All you got to do is onboard them to Arc. We'll push out the extension and make sure it's configured correctly. Alternatively, if you want to do it manually, you can use ARM templates. And we also have PowerShell and command line available now too, if you want to just go and write up your own script to deploy it.
Cool. My mind was going to agents the whole time during those two questions. Question for you, Jason. When will Azure Arc Kubernetes be supported in Azure DevOps? Verified it is not in an environment nor a service connection.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that's unique about Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters is they can be running anywhere. And so for Azure DevOps to have the ability to connect your clusters, we need to make that network path available. So there is a feature that we are actively working on right now called Cluster Connect. that would allow Azure services like Azure DevOps and pipelines and environments to be able to talk directly to an Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. So you keep your eyes open or your ear to the rail. We'll be bringing that functionality out in a public preview capability soon.
Cool. Question for you, Nir. Is there a plan to combine 3 known agents, MMA, dependency agent, Arc, into one?
There is no plan to combine the Arc agent into these 2 agents. And I don't know about the plans for these 2 agents. Yeah, so no plans that I know of. We did combine the guest configuration agent and the Arc agent together, so you don't need to install the guest configuration agent when you install Arc. It comes with it.
Cool. Question for you, Ryan. Will Arc support Windows Server 2008 R2 onboarding?
Yeah, so we don't support 2008 R2 today. The minimum Windows version is 2012, but it is something we're looking into adding in the near term.
Question for Jason. Does Azure Arc play well with Openshift running on Azure, being either the ARO or GCP from Red Hat?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the goals for Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes is any Kubernetes anywhere. And as long as the Kubernetes cluster is CNCF conformant, we should be able to deploy our operator into that cluster and give you, the basic inventory visibility into the Azure portal, as well as starting to apply, GitOps-based configurations to that cluster. So that works for, GCP-based clusters that you provision on your own infrastructure or any other cloud provider. In terms of ARO, you can onboard the ARO cluster as an Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. You will see 2 resources in the portal, and we're working from a roadmap perspective to make sure that those GitOps scenarios, for example, are integrated more deeply into that offering.
Awesome. Question for Brian. Would you be able to leverage a simple Azure SQL database through Azure Arc? Not a fully managed instance.
Yeah, so right now we are just focused on SQL managed instance, just as how we are focused on enabling Postgres hyperscale. So it's a good question because by virtue of this initial set of data services, we are just looking at these deployment options as the initial set of services. As we go through the course of the year, and as Tolga alluded to earlier, we will look at enabling more services and even more sub-services with the entirety of SQL database, as well as Azure database for Postgres down the line. But for now, we are just focused on the preview with managed instance and Postgres hyperscale.
Let me call out just that, we also announced a preview of the Azure Arc for SQL Server, where if you have existing SQL servers, say you have 1,000 SQL servers today, I don't know how you manage them, you can onboard them to Arc and actually see all the SQL instances of your server running on-prem in Azure. And then capabilities that are enabled for these are a very, very important capability of the SQL assessment at scale and the security, the advanced threat protection security that's coming from Azure. All of these are available through this Arc for SQL Server. So you have 1,000 machines today, you don't know where they are, you don't know who's using what. You can onboard them as SQL Server to Arc, and you will get the immediate visibility, inventory tagging, as well as the security mechanisms and the assessment mechanisms without needing to do an expensive migration of your code to another platform.
Cool. And Jason, I'm going to ask you a really quick question because we're running out of time. Currently, you only offer GitOps through Flux and Arc-enabled servers. Any plans to support AKS?
That is a great question, and it is something we're actively working on. So keep your eyes open.
Awesome. And I think with that, we really appreciate all the questions. It's awesome to see all the interaction that we had here. I want to make sure that you get access to some of the resources that we're providing. The first one is the Azure Arc Learning Path, so feel free to check it out. We also have a lot of information all up to date in the Arc website, aka.ms Azure Arc Info. We created a bunch of skilling videos. They are hosted on YouTube, so they are deeper level content for Arc-enabled servers, Kubernetes, and data. And lastly, feel free to check out the Azure Arc plus Azure Infrastructure mini-series. It's also linked here. Thank you very much for all the questions again, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.